Okay, perfect. All right, we're going to get started. I'm Shannon McWeeney. I'm the division head for Bioinformatics and Computational Biology, also now known as Computational Biomedicine, and I'll talk a little bit about that change in my talk. My work, I'm a methodologist, and so my research has really been focused in a couple of areas. I use the phrase on this slide about solving research bottlenecks, and so the idea is that all of the methodology work that we do is problem-driven. And so a setting like OHSU, which is a university hospital, is ideal for this. So we're really thinking about what are the obstacles, not just for research, but very importantly for the clinicians and for our patients, and trying to improve outcomes and care. A lot of my work actually is focused around what we call precision medicine. And this is thinking about how do we identify the right drug, and not just the right drug for a patient or a group of patients, but the right dose, the right timing for that drug, et cetera. And so that's a key component of my work that I do with the OHSU Knight Cancer Institute, which is our cancer center here. I'd like to give a little bit of background about me, and I'm not going to read this slide, but I'm going to mention a couple of things. My training was non-traditional, and we have a lot of people in the program that have non-traditional training. In fact, I think the more diverse your background is, sometimes the better off you are in terms of your perspective. So my PhD was in statistical genetics, which is exactly like it sounds, a very quantitative, rigorous assessment, but very applied in genetics. So I worked on complex diseases. And then I went on and did a postdoc, which also was further training and certification, getting a master's in computational biology. And one of the reasons for that is that I was recognizing that the amount of data that we were generating and analyzing was growing vastly, and I did not have the skills computationally to handle it. So quantitatively and methodologically, I could think about the data and the problems, but I also needed that computational training as well. And I would, and I'll come back to this, but I think the idea that to really be effective in this area, you really are looking at interdisciplinary training and hybrids, right? So my training reflects genetics and biology. It reflects statistics and mathematics. It reflects computer science. I would also argue there's a lot of things around kind of cognitive aspects, and I'll talk about that again at the end as well, just in terms of how we think about making data or knowledge accessible to other people. But I definitely think that in terms of the best return on investment, all of my quantitative skills really became this kind of arsenal or tools in my toolkit that I've been able to use for a variety of problems. So when I started, I was working on complex diseases, in particular autoimmune disorders like type 1 diabetes, and that gradually shifted to really now my focus is on predominantly cancer, but also infectious disease, where I do a lot of work, as I mentioned, around thinking about new therapies, also drug repurposing and prioritizing targets for developing therapies. So I like to use an example that came from a lecture, or talk that was given by Jim Gray, who is a scientist at Microsoft, which kind of really describes where we are right now, because a lot of people have misconceptions about what are the real challenges that we have in terms of dealing with the vast amounts of data that we're generating. So Jim laid out this idea of these paradigm shifts in terms of the way that we think about the world around us, and very importantly, the way that we're attempting to process that information and gain knowledge. And so the first paradigm shift was really descriptive, where we were largely going around and cataloging the world around us, just describing it, very qualitative. We then went into the second paradigm, and this is theoretical, where now we were able to abstract and think about concepts that we could not see, and actually do much more complex abstraction. We just emerged from the computational paradigm. And so this is where the misconception is. We can handle vast amounts of data. In fact, we have approaches that will allow us to handle data we can't even store. So we can develop very sophisticated data structures, very sophisticated algorithms. But what that has placed us in, so that's not the challenge. It's placed us now in this fourth paradigm, which is around exploration. And so I use this term about having data be accessible. A lot of people think that means open data. Can I share data? Can I download it or touch it? That's not at all what I mean. I mean accessible in terms of knowledge. So you have very complex data structures. You have a ton of data that's coming at people. How do we make sure that cognitively, and this is where the cognition part comes in, that they can actually interpret that and get meaning from it and make it actionable? And that's critical for medicine. And that's really why, in terms of our focus, especially given the representation of being in a university hospital, we shifted from this idea of kind of the traditional computational biology, which is often much more focused in basic science, to computational biomedicine, really leveraging the environment around us. And our training reflects that as well. I would point out that this is also where there's the greatest need. So if you're interested in things like visualization, et cetera, this is massive. We're actually actively recruiting people from other sectors, not science, because it's so critical that we can make it clear that this information is accessible in the way that I just described. Ironically, and I didn't put it in my slide deck, they just announced that Tableau had been acquired, which is a visualization and kind of reporting software. It was one of the largest acquisitions ever for a visualization-based software. And it really, again, harkened to this idea that a lot of this is going to be around context and interpretation. That's really what's going to be critical as we move forward. Now, we talk about all this vast amounts of data, and I always think it's good to make this somewhat personal in terms of the amount of data that you're generating. So this is a slide from some collaborators at Intel and IBM. And what you're looking at is the various types of data that we might generate. And what I want you to think about is that when we think in a healthcare setting, people talk about clinical data. And we always imagine that to be vastly more than it actually is. It really is about 10% when we think about determinants of health, right? And it's actually the smallest of all the data you're going to generate in your overall lifetime. Then we think about genomics, and this is an area where, again, because of sequencing, the idea that you can sequence your genome, that if you have cancer, for example, we'd sequence the tumor. This is thought to be a major piece of data. It is larger than the clinical data, but it's still nowhere close to the exogenous data. So this is your behavioral, the socioeconomic, environmental, all of the data that you're just passively generating that we're now starting to collect, which actually is critical when we think about a lot of the, and I'll show you an example of this, a lot of the type of modeling and understanding we really want to do, especially because the environmental factors, behavioral factors are so critical in medicine. That's the majority of the data that you will generate, and that's the part that we're often overlooking. So Eric Schadt developed this idea in this slide of the data ecosystem. This is a very common concept, but I really love his interpretation of it in this image because he's pointing out a lot of those exogenous passive data types that you are generating. So if you're doing any kind of banking or financial transactions, traffic patterns, as we all know, many of us use things like Google Maps or Waze. My iPhone at any time knows where I am, where I've parked my car. I don't know if any of you have seen that, where it'll just passively tell you, you just parked your car here. I haven't asked it to do that. Obviously, the cell phone in terms of social media, text, anything that you download. We also have things like security and automation, air traffic. Definitely when we think about infectious disease and things like that, we definitely think about transit. So things like air traffic, weather, GPS. All of this data is being generated and actually captured in some form that could be leveraged. And the reason that we think this is important is because when we think about what we're actually focusing on in terms of your health, so we think about things like obesity. Obesity is going to be, so obesity is a really great clinical trait to think about in terms of studying because it is a corner piece to many other diseases. So when you think about cardiovascular disease, patients often will also have obesity. Right? If we think about, there's a co-occurrence, for example, of obesity and many addiction behaviors. So it's very hard to isolate some of these phenotypes. They're actually connected. And what may be hard to see is that on this, we're actually looking at a graph that's basically connecting a lot of these different disease phenotypes together. A great example is type 2 diabetes, which we know has an environmental component, and obesity would obviously be a key thing that we need to consider when we're treating a patient with type 2 diabetes. So we think about all of this, but we need to think about not just the interplay of the genetics and the clinical data with respect to these different diseases or phenotypes the patient has, but also thinking it in the context of the environment. And it's from that that we really will get much better models for predicting disease. Now, the use case that's often used for this that is very common to think about is, as I mentioned, infectious disease or a pandemic, where you'll see people modeling, really thinking about transmission. But we're thinking about this much more broadly, just in terms of understanding what were the things that you were exposed to. How do those exposures actually change your susceptibility to things? And that may not just be things like viruses or pathogens, but also if you've had a lot of environmental exposures that may have increased your risk for things like cancer, for example. All of that are the pieces of the puzzle that we need to kind of put together. So one of the things that is really important to me is that I have what I call my internal barometer in terms of why I get up in the morning and do the work that I do. And this is an image that was taken with the patient's permission and her family's permission from photography, 24-hour photography, basically documentation of OHSU called One Day at OHSU. And this is Autumn, who was one of our patients at the time and was being treated. And the good news, of course, is that this had a good ending in terms of her outcome. It was positive, which is great. But when we think about a patient like Autumn, there's a number of questions that we want to ask, and this starts when they're diagnosed. We think about things like, are they going to respond to the standard of care? And for certain diseases, especially some of the ones that I work on, the answer is almost always no. Because unless the patient has a very favorable risk or outcome, it's often the case that that might fail them. We want to think about what the treatment plan is that's best for them. If the patient does relapse, then what's going to be our next line of defense in terms of second-line therapies? And this is critical to us. So we tend to think about this as basically a life cycle in terms of how we're thinking about monitoring and following the patient. And this goes, again, relating back to that idea of precision medicine. What we want to be able to do is improve that. We want to be able to improve, number one, the standard of care. That's the ultimate goal. But because this is in a research context right now, what we're hoping to do is understand what are the best lines of therapy in terms of the second lines of therapy after relapse or recurrence to help our patients. So what happens is that when a patient comes in, remember we're talking about the different data types that we collect. We have the clinical data, which is in the electronic health record. That will include things, obviously, like the symptoms, vitals, et cetera, but very importantly also family history, which could be really relevant. And then with diagnosis, and this is part of a research, this model that I'm showing you here is part of a research study that has been actively ongoing for over 5 years, if not more, at OHSU and other sites to really this is a cancer story, where when the patient is consented and enrolled in the study, along with being, receiving their primary diagnosis and being cared for, we're doing a number of things in the background with the patient's consent to samples that they're providing. So basically, a diagnostic or a pre-treatment sample, and this is important, we're characterizing things like when we think about genomic sequencing, so what mutations in a cancer that they might have. We're characterizing what are the levels of the gene expression that they might have, because that can actually help us in terms of understanding what is dysregulated or aberrant from the cancer. We're looking for things like upregulation, what might be targetable to drugs. And then we do a series of functional assays in which we're actually testing the patient's sample with a large number of small molecules, so testing them with drugs to actually try to predict how they might respond. Now remember, this is a clinical study, research study, so the patient will go on to standard of care. And then, especially for some of the diseases I work on, like acute myeloid leukemia, the patient unfortunately has a high probability of potentially relapsing or not responding to the standard of care. And if that's the case, then we would repeat this cycle again. And now we're in the paradigm where they might be appropriate for a clinical trial, and we can begin to think about this. And we update all that information. And behind the scenes, we're modeling that to try and understand what would be the right, based on all the data we've collected, what do we think the right potential targeted therapy or combination therapy is for this patient. And the goal is that we can learn from this so that when someone comes in, we've either updated the standard of care so we have the best option for them from the beginning, or we're ready, if the standard of care does fail them, with a therapy that we know they have a much better chance of responding to. And this is work that I think, as I mentioned, was done at multiple sites. 11 different academic institutions were part of this consortia for this model for acute myeloid leukemia, which we call Beat AML, and 11 different pharmaceutical companies as well. Now, there is a component. I mentioned to you that, in this case, the Beat AML model was a collaboration. We had 11 different sites, sharing data and consenting patients and collecting this information. And that resource went public in 2018, in October of 2018, and it was made immediately available to the research community with the idea that we wanted to be able to share this data. But we know that clinically, we have a number of things that are happening where the data is often locked because of a number of measures which are actually, in principle, great to actually protect, the patient in terms of security, et cetera, privacy, very importantly. But we have patients that actually want their data shared. And so there's been a huge discussion publicly around the patient's right of access, which is a legal thing that every patient has, and how can we actually improve that so that if they want their data shared with a research study, it's not trapped in the initial hospital where they had their care. This slide is actually from an opinion piece from Lori Beckland, and she was a breast cancer patient. When she was diagnosed, the breast cancer had metastasized, and it had metastasized to almost every one of the major kind of common metastatic sites that we think about. So normally the prognosis would actually be very poor. She went on to live another 7 or 8 years beyond this. And when she finally was succumbing to the disease, she wrote this opinion piece. And what she commented on is that if there's another patient like her in the United States or in the world, where they have similar clinical characteristics, potentially even similar tumor types, et cetera, her information about what happened to her and her kind of journey clinically, what she responded to, what she didn't, trying to understand what was special about the ability for her to have this, longer-term survival with very advanced metastatic disease. That could potentially help another patient, but it was basically going to be trapped in the electronic health record. And she brought up this idea that every patient basically is a one-person clinical trial, and that if this data was going to die with her, this would be criminal. And I think that message has really been heard loud and clear, and there's been a tremendous amount of effort that even though this data is now collected electronically, we still often have these barriers around it being inaccessible. And in this way, I am talking about actually the sharing part, the ability to touch it, right? So there's two versions of accessible. There's the accessible in terms of knowledge, can I understand it cognitively, and there's the accessible in terms of is it being shared. And our mission really is to work on both of those kind of simultaneously. This hopefully should be the easier one, although this often ends up because of, as we talked about, security and compliance issues. Definitely, there's a cultural component to the hospitals as well. Many hospitals see some of this data as intellectual property. So we really need an education, not only to help our patients understand what their rights are, but also of the hospitals and universities as well. So as I mentioned to you before, we have all of this data that we're generating, and especially in the clinic, so we have this idea of how we're kind of reshaping medicine. So I showed you the research version in which we were doing all of this genomic and functional characterization. But right now at OHSU, we routinely have in our cancer care sequencing that is being done of our patients. Often it's a targeted panel, but sequencing that's being done where we can give information about various mutations that they may have, and we can follow them longitudinally. And the reason this is important is a patient starts treatment, and what we're trying to understand is how much of the disease burden is left. Or still present, and we call this minimal residual disease, and so we can monitor that through the sequencing. It's not perfect yet, but it is something that is actually very vital in terms of thinking about care, as well as potentially understanding what drugs they might respond to. Now, as we try to add complexity to that data, in terms of either doing, rather than just doing a targeted panel of a set of genes, doing whole exome or whole genome sequencing, the amount of information that then has to be analyzed and presented back is challenging, and we now have this separation between the clinician and the data in terms of these algorithms that it's no longer transparent to them. The other challenge is that bioinformatics is also kind of seen as a rate-limiting step. So those are the kind of things that we want to try and change, and there's a number of ways that we can do that. We've talked about the making data accessible and the visualization, which is key cognitively, but going to the point I just mentioned about this kind of disconnect between the clinician or the oncologist who's actually going to be making a decision to care for the patient, using all of their expertise and needing to understand now this, let's say, recommendation or analysis summary that came computationally. We have to make sure that that data is clear in terms of being transparent, them really understanding how confident we are, if there's any uncertainty around it. So there's that education as well. And then finally, we really need to think about the human data interaction piece. And this dovetails really nicely back into what I already mentioned to you about the work that's been happening on really empowering and engaging patients to understand their role in their data. And so there's a number of concepts that come up here. One of the most important ones is negotiability, also agency. We want patients to feel like they have autonomy when it comes to their data. It is their data. So if they want to share it with another institution, even if it was collected at one hospital, if they want to consent to be in a study, if they want to stop participating in a study. All of those things are really critical that we're actually providing that to them. And we think a lot about human-computer interaction, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of the visualization, but that human data interaction and really supporting that is critical. All of the heart of all research is our patients, especially clinical research and translational research. And so we need them to be active partners with us. And that's not always the way that patients feel. It's not always the way it's presented to them. And for that to happen, they have to have autonomy in terms of that partnership. So that's a major focus that's happening now, not just nationally, but internationally as well. So I want to just talk a little bit, and then we can take some questions, about the program here. So I mentioned to you that we really try to leverage the environment around us, and that's really where the computational biomedicine component came from. There's a number of other areas that I'll mention to you, and some of them we have them really kind of focused on healthcare, clinical, and translational research, but they can be applied anywhere. So you see machine learning is on that list, and as you know, in the news right now, machine learning is being applied to everything. But there have been a number of very promising aspects for machine learning in terms of things like imaging, and also some other key clinical areas where this is really being investigated. Text mining and information retrieval, this can apply to any type of literature or text where you're trying to pull back actual concepts, especially if the data is unstructured. Here we really focus on things like the electronic health record. So a ton of data is captured when you come into the hospital. Most of it, though, is often in the notes, so free text. And so the idea that we can use computational approaches to basically take that data out, extract it, reason on it, and help us identify those key concepts is really important. I already mentioned my background in statistical genetics. Analytics is also another really important one. Again, analytics and data science is very broad, covers many areas. Here we're really focusing on this in the context of healthcare analytics. We have a partnership with Kaiser in which they teach a course every summer. They come in and we actually, you get to kind of shadow them in terms of what is it really like to be doing healthcare analytics in a system like Kaiser. And very importantly, you go through the entire life cycle of what that's like in terms of if we're thinking about actually implementing a new algorithm that would help in making determinations. So one of the examples that we use is, what's the readmission risk? If a patient comes in, the hospital needs to know, depending on my next step, how high or how likely is it they're going to be readmitted? And so how do you implement an algorithm like that? How do you evaluate it? And then how do you make the decision, or the recommendation back to your organization about what should be done next? And so those are all things that you actually get to do with them and get feedback from their team and their experts. So what happens in the program in the first year, in the summer, there is an online boot camp. So in data science and in bioinformatics and computational biomedicine and computational biology, we often talk about a couple of key programming languages. One is Python, which you learn in the program, and the other is R, which is a statistical language, which is actually also really critical. There is an online boot camp for R. If you've never had any programming experience, there's also an online kind of refresher course for Python, and then you formally take the full Python course, which is really focused on scientific scripting in the fall. You also do research rotations. You can start those then. And then you have kind of our core coursework in the fall, winter, and spring. And it's actually fairly prescribed because there's so much material that we need to cover. So we do things like statistical methods and algorithms, but instead of those being kind of just general stats or computer science courses, they're completely focused on the translational and clinical domain. So you're learning about them in terms of the type of data that we're analyzing actively right now. So very, very applied. We also have a course which is on large-scale data management. We used to do kind of a standard database course. Turns out the vast amounts of data that we're handling far exceed what you can do with kind of traditional data management approaches. And so we really focus on that as well. And then there's also the continued research rotations. You have a kind of mentored project-based research methods component, and it's split between winter and spring, but the main component is in spring, and that has taken numerous forms. Sometimes it's that you're being co-mentored by faculty who are either clinicians or basic scientists with one of our faculty. Other times it's actually you working on a key problem nationally. And so we've been in a number of these national competitions which are focused on various kind of key problems in medicine and translational research, and actually our teams have actually done quite well on that. And in those competitions, you're actually pairing with a key organization or set of collaborators. So all of this is around collaborative research, and then obviously the potential to plan for summer internships. I should mention that in the subsequent years, in the second year, you're still doing courses. It's really focused at that point on a lot of the electives that you might want to be doing in terms of this. So machine learning is a requirement in our program. A lot of students take advanced machine learning and other kind of specializations, deep learning, et cetera, in their second year, because that's an area that they really feel they need strength in. You could obviously do extensions around data management, statistical methods. So that is, while there's a lot of core courses, we really try to customize it to what you're trying to achieve. And I think that's key for anywhere that you go or any type of studying that you do. You shouldn't be completely locked down. So if someone comes in with a computer science background, they're not going to be doing a lot of the computational courses necessarily, but they may have a deficit in terms of some of the biological or medical domain or in terms of statistics, et cetera. And so we do try to tailor that. And the electives very much are tailored to the type of research that you're interested in doing or the type of areas that you're really drawn to. The job prospects in this field are varied, and you'll notice they go across a large number of different sectors, basically all sectors. And we have some great examples of these. I will mention as well, which is kind of an in-between hybrid, we do have these ideas of these nonprofit entities, and we actually have close relationships with a number of them that are kind of in between academia and private. So things like the Institute for Systems Biology or the Allen Brain Institute. So these are regional up in Seattle, so very close. They've hosted a number of our students for internships or actually hired them. And these are the type of partners where if you're thinking about something a little bit non-traditional in terms of that kind of think tank or nonprofit institution rather than definitely going into industry or pharma, et cetera, that's an option too. And then depending on the degree, there's a variety of different options that you have. I would make the comment that it really depends on you. We have a number of people here at OHSU who had master's level training and are basically leading initiatives and projects. So a lot of it is going to be based on the skill set and kind of the training that that individual has done. We also, as I mentioned, have had a lot of hybrids. So we've trained lawyers, we've trained genetic counselors, we have people with very different backgrounds coming in who want this training and maybe want to add it to their career or are looking to have a different career. So salaries will vary. These are all low estimates because they came from an earlier survey that Glassdoor had done. But just to give you an idea of the range, we have had an issue, I think many places have had, where we will often have people recruiting our students before they finish. We have a really great partnership, as I mentioned, with Kaiser, but they often are looking at our students as possible recruits, so that's great from a job perspective as well. But especially for the skills that we mentioned, and as we talked about, a lot of these are core skills that could be applied almost anywhere. So I think what's really important if you're coming to a university hospital is because you're really interested in using these quantitative skills, thinking about it in terms of healthcare, medicine, or translational research. That would be the reason to come to an institution like this, because you can do machine learning or analytics anywhere. And what we really have to offer is that application of really thinking about it in terms of trying to change and transform human health and the treatment of disease. Also, I should mention there's a spectrum there. It's not all just focused on the disease component. There's a tremendous amount of work on patient outreach and engagement and prevention as well. At the Cancer Center, which I already mentioned to you before, at the Knight Cancer Institute, there's an entire major center which is focused on early detection, which is CEDAR. So we have this whole kind of spectrum of basically, thinking about the lifespan. How can we prevent these diseases? And if you unfortunately do have one of them, how can we best care for you? That continues on also into things like survivorship as well. So I just want to finish with some examples of career advice that we often like to talk about in terms of, I'm often asked about what the best advice I can give people. I have people contacting me from all over. I'm not going to read them to you, but I am going to mention this last one. So there was a really fantastic study done originally in the economics sector and then later in the social sciences called Good to Great. This is a number of years ago. And one of the things that they looked at was what makes originally a business very successful. And you kind of had this Venn diagram of things, and the sweet spot was in the middle. And the way that they phrased it is, what are you good at, or what's the company good at, what are you passionate about, and what is sustainable? So any of these skills that we just talked about are highly sustainable in terms of your job prospects, right? That's there. The key questions for you is this something that's playing to your strengths? And this is, again, most of this work, as we talked about, unless you're a clinician or someone who's getting this training to augment, or a lawyer to augment your career, if you're really thinking about this as being your career, then you are looking at stuff that is definitely more detail-oriented, more quantitative in our area. So are those your strengths? And if the answers to those are yes, then the last question is this something that makes you want to get up in the morning and do it? And that's kind of the internal barometer piece. If all of those things are there, I think you found your sweet spot. And the nice thing is the fact that the sustainable one, because a lot of times people have their passion of what they want to do and they're good at, but it's very hard for them to make a living with it. In this case, there's such a huge demand for this, such a huge need for this skill set, that it is one of the things that is kind of guaranteed. The key is that the other two pieces for you personally are in place. There's a number of ways that you can get involved. I'm just showing you some of the social media and the website. All of the seminars, today they're recording this for a webinar, but all of the seminars are recorded and are on YouTube, so you can watch any of them. And if you're local, or in the case of our interns, you'll be here this summer, we have seminars that are held on Thursday. We often have special seminars in which we're hosting people, and that's a great way to find out not just about our faculty here, and we'll have a number of faculty giving kind of overview talks this summer, but also we'll have invited collaborators and guests coming in to talk about a lot of key topics. So with that, I'm happy, at least here in the room, to take any questions.
First question, as someone who, 10 years ago, I had stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Mm-hmm.
I was saved after a failed stem cell transplant with a clinical trial at MD Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually what drove me into this space. I was a database engineer at Oracle at the time, so pretty steep in the in the data realm. How does one get access to their information? Let's say you were saved by a clinical trial. You
Yep.
get access to your information. You want to use yourself as a case model because, frankly, I'd like to know if I'm going to relapse. I learned enough about my own genomics, and I was able to prolong my aunt's life. She had a rare lung cancer that actually shared a marker with mine.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to direct her to ask about Tarceva. And so she got on Tarceva, and she's still alive after 6 years of something she's stage 4 terminal.
Right.
So how do I get access to my own information? How would I walk through this for myself?
Right. So, so great question. There's a couple of ways to unpack that. So, because we didn't mic you, I'll just repeat the question because this is recorded. The question was, and you gave your personal story here, but as a patient, former patient, how do you get access to your information, especially if you're thinking about your long-term care in terms of disease relapse? So you said multiple things, and I want to unpack them. So the clinical trial data by law, it is required that that is actually released and shared. And so there is clinicaltrials.gov, which is where not just, and very importantly for a clinical trial, I know you're thinking about it individually. It's not just you, but it's very importantly the trial overall. What you want to know is, what did we find? We do have, and we talked about this idea of N of 1 clinical trials, but very importantly, you'd want to know what was the overall success of this, what was the relapse, things like that, whatever the outcomes were. So that's one way to find that out, and you should hopefully have that information, or you could always contact MD Anderson. But you can look up on ct.gov, the site, et cetera, and if you know the approximate timing. This was a federal regulation that came aboard later than we would have liked, so depending on the timing of the trial, it may or may not be there, but it is the requirement now that all clinical trials are actually captured in that way and shared, even if their results are negative, which is very important, because before we only had them publishing results that were in publications, et cetera, and we really need to know what's happening in these trials so we have a landscape idea. In terms of your clinical data for your actual care, so I'm assuming if you were at MD Anderson for a clinical trial, you also were receiving treatment through MD Anderson. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Houston on a regular basis. I was from Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So Charles Sternad was in Oklahoma. He took care of me. He went through when my stem cell transplant failed.
Mm-hmm.
Then stage 4, I had nothing to lose. So then I went to Houston
right.
and went there for.
So that is where and I mentioned this term right of access, which is under HIPAA, and this is this idea that you as a patient have the right to your data. And there are very few restrictions on that. Now, the key is what format you get it back in, and that's what we're working on nationally, is to try and improve that. The challenge also is that you have to, unfortunately, go to each, unless they're part of a network. So unless the Oklahoma site was part of MD Anderson's network, you probably would have to go to the multiple different care providers or hospitals that you were seen at to get your data. But you absolutely have the right. Sometimes that will be online. Some centers have an app where you can do it through a patient portal. Other times you have to actually send in a written or fax request. It varies, and that's another thing we're trying to improve. Especially at the cancer center level, we think about this a lot, about how do we make this better and how can we standardize this for our patients across the centers. So that's another component. And then there's other aspects which only you have, which we would call patient-reported, things that might not be collected but would actually be important if you're thinking about yourself completely. If you were involved in any clinical sequencing, the consent would actually determine what was released back to you. This is a great kind of segue when we do sequencing, especially if it's, so a clinical trial is a research study. So the data is not the same. Like I mentioned to you, we have our targeted panels that we use in care. Those are what we call CLIA assays. They can be put into the electronic health record, and they're used for clinical decision-making all the time. A research study may not be, in a clinical trial, it's almost always CLIA, but it depends on if you had data that, so I mentioned the Beat AML study. Much of our data is done just for research, and so it's not all CLIA. So we do have the CLIA targeted panels, but we also have the other data. So your consent would actually dictate if you could get that data back. So when you signed it, and part of that is also to protect you, because if the data wasn't done in a CLIA lab, we wouldn't want you or anyone else analyzing it because we don't have that same level of confidence in the data. For example, was the sequencing as deep as CLIA? CLIA labs are incredibly deep. You know, what was the protocol and was it standardized? Those are the things that we worry about. So that would be something up front. There's been a ton of engagement with patients on the fact that when you go to a hospital, you can actually negotiate what happens to your biospecimens. A lot of people don't know this. You can negotiate in your consent about what's going to happen. There should be a genetic counselor if you're doing genetic testing as part of a study. There's always one in clinical care, but in a research study. And there's actually huge discussions around what data we can give back. And part of this is, of course, because we don't want to give you the wrong information. And if it was not done in these standardized, clinical labs, there's real concern about that. Now, there are great examples, and I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but I can give it to Lauren to post. And if you Google Sequence Me, this is an individual who is actually one of our, this is why it's so embarrassing, I can't remember his name, but very active and been very engaged at Intel. And he's a wonderful story of where he actually had, and we have a collaboration with Intel around precision medicine. He actually had his sequencing done and has been analyzing the data himself. And he's very active in the community about patient engagement. He's also in that camp of really trying to do anything that he can to augment. This is very common in the rare disease community too. We have amazing stories here. So we are trying to change that model so that the patient is much more driving this, but we still have many reasons that we have to be careful, because if we ever give you the wrong information, then this could actually undermine the entire all these programs. So that's the weight. And so there is this, the rare disease one, we often think about anonymity. So in many studies, if you have less than 5 people who have a disease, we end up collapsing it together. So you don't actually get individual patient level information because you could actually identify the patient. The rare disease community kind of blew that open and was like, no, we want to be able to share all of this. So if the patients, or in this case, if their children, their parents, are willing to do this and are willing to be part of a consortium where data that we normally wouldn't, this is the issue. The patients have to be educated, and they have to be consenting, knowing what they're consenting to. This is all cultural. The risks, we actually believe, are very small. You know what I'm saying, in terms of if someone got your information. They often will throw out the case of an insurance company. The one that might have some cachet would be a politician. Obviously, if there's someone that could be blackmailed because of their data. But we actually believe the risks are very small. But we still have many responsibilities to the patient to make sure that it is correct, to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that, that the consent is in place. But we do want to have a dialogue around that relationship in terms of the consent. And I apologize, I can't remember his name. But if you look him up, it should come right away. And if not, I can send it to Lauren. Any other questions? Okay, if not, or if you think of them later, for the interns, I'm here all summer. And then obviously anyone on the webinar, you can email questions to Lauren. All right, thank you.